Good evening, dear friends, and welcome to Watson's Margins. I'm Edward. Glad you found a quiet moment to join me. Tell me, is there a lamp burning near you, the evening finally settling into stillness? These are the hours Watson trusted most, when patience and observation revealed what daylight concealed. Do subscribe, so no detail escapes you, and you'll find our Spotify channel in the description below. Now, settle in. For the world is full of obvious things which nobody by any chance ever observes. Chapter 1. The Fog on Baker Street. It is a curious thing, and one I have remarked upon more than once in the course of my long association with Mr. Sherlock Holmes, that the most singular affairs have a habit of presenting themselves during those quiet hours when the mind is most at rest. It was on just such an evening, in the late November of a year I shall not more precisely specify, that the business of the Fairleigh testament was first laid before us, disturbing a calm which had, if I am honest, begun to weigh upon my companion in the manner that stillness always did. The fog that night was of the particular London variety which I have never encountered reproduced elsewhere, thick, yellowish, and clinging, pressing itself against the windows of our Baker Street rooms as though curious about the affairs within. The gas lamps in the street below were mere suggestions of light, halos of amber dissolving before they could illuminate so much as the opposite pavement. I had drawn my chair close to the fire after dinner, occupied with the British Medical Journal, and had fallen into that pleasant half-reading, the half-reverie which is among the more civilised comforts a man may enjoy. Holmes, for his part, had been lying upon the sofa for the better part of 2 hours, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, his grey eyes fixed upon the ceiling with an expression I had come to recognise as the outward sign of an inward vacancy. Not sleep, not thought, but a sort of deliberate suspension of his remarkable faculties, as a pianist rests his hands between movements. He had spoken only once in the preceding hour. "Watson," he had said without altering his position or lowering his gaze from the ceiling, "you are not reading." "I am," I protested. "You have not turned a page in 22 minutes, and you have twice reached for your pipe without lighting it. You are elsewhere, my dear fellow, though I shall not press you on the destination." I conceded the point without argument. It was easier, in my experience, to concede Holmes's minor observations than to contest them, particularly when they were accurate. So we sat in companionable silence, while the fog thickened and the fire burned down, and I confess I had begun to consider retiring for the evening when the bell at the street door sounded below. I heard Mrs. Hudson's measured tread in the hallway, the brief exchange of voices, and then her familiar ascent of the stair. Holmes had not moved, but I noticed that the steepled fingers had separated, a small but, as I knew, significant alteration. "A gentleman, Mr. Holmes," said she, appearing at the door with the composed neutrality she brought to all announcements, as though the hour and the weather were equally unremarkable. "A Mr. Pembroke. He says he is a solicitor, and that the matter is of some delicacy. Show him up, Mrs. Hudson, and bring fresh tea if you would be so kind." Holmes rose from the sofa in a single fluid motion, and arranged himself in his chair by the fire with the air of a man who had been sitting upright and attentive for some time. I have occasionally wondered whether this small theatre was performed for the benefit of our visitors, to suggest an ease and availability that his actual brooding state might have contradicted. He never confirmed or denied the practice when I raised it. Mr. Alistair Pembroke entered our sitting-room with the measured precision of a man accustomed to the management of other people's affairs. He was perhaps 60 years of age, are compact and upright in bearing, with silver hair brushed back from a broad forehead, and a face whose dominant quality was control, the control of expression, of gesture, of the small betrayals by which most men inadvertently communicate their inner weather. He was dressed impeccably in a black frock coat, and he carried a leather case of the kind solicitors employ for documents, requiring a degree of discretion beyond the ordinary. His boots, I observed, were freshly blacked, but had been walked in at some length this evening, and there was a faint damp along his shoulders where the fog had settled. "Mr. Holmes," said he, taking the chair which Holmes indicated with a brief gesture. I am sensible of the hour, and I shall not waste your time with preamble. My name is Alistair Pembroke. I am a partner in the firm of Pembroke Gaines and Cathcart, with chambers in Lincoln's Inn. I have practised for 35 years, and in that time I do not believe I have presented myself at a private individual's door in the evening without an appointment. He paused. I do so now because I find myself in possession of a concern which I cannot in good conscience submit to the ordinary machinery of my profession. Holmes regarded him with the steady, dispassionate attention he habitually brought to opening statements. "Proceed," he said. Pembroke set his case upon his knee and opened it with deliberate hands. From it he withdrew a single document, folded and sealed, or rather, partially sealed, for I could observe even from my position beside the fire that the wax closure was incomplete, broken at one edge as though disturbed before it had fully set. "This," said Pembroke, "is the final testament of Lady Eugenia Fairleigh, of Fairleigh House, Kensington. Lady Fairleigh died 4 days ago. The cause of death was recorded by her physician as cardiac failure, and I have no reason to dispute that finding on medical grounds." He placed the document flat upon his knee and pressed one hand upon it, as though it might otherwise escape. "The difficulty, Mr. Holmes, is this. Lady Fairleigh had summoned me to her house 3 days before her death, and informed me that she wished to revise her will substantially. I attended her, I drew up the revised document, I reviewed it with her line by line, and she expressed herself entirely satisfied with its contents. She requested that I leave the document with her that she might read it once more at her leisure, and sign it the following morning." He paused. "She was dead before morning came." "And the document was not signed," said Holmes. "It was not. Which means the previous testament stands." "It does." "And the previous testament," said Holmes, leaning forward very slightly, "favours a party who would not have fared so well under the revised version." Pembroke looked at him steadily. "You apprehend the difficulty." "I apprehend several difficulties. What I do not yet apprehend is why you have brought the matter to me rather than to the police, or indeed why you regard it as a criminal matter at all. A woman dies before signing a document. It is tragic, perhaps even unfortunate in its timing, but it is not, on its face, irregular." For the first time, something moved behind Pembroke's composed features. Not distress precisely, but the suppressed acknowledgment of distress. "When I attended the house to retrieve the unsigned testament," said he, "the document was not where Lady Fairleigh had placed it. It had been moved, Mr. Holmes, and the sealing wax, which I myself had affixed to the envelope before leaving, had been disturbed." He lifted the document briefly. "Furthermore, there are certain details about the room in which she died which, when I attended to offer the family my condolences and attend to the immediate legal formalities, struck me as inconsistent with the account I had been given of her final evening." Holmes pressed his fingertips together. The fire crackled. Outside, the fog pressed its blank face against the glass. "Inconsistent in what respect?" said Holmes. The writing desk in her sitting room had been laid out with pen and ink as though she had intended to write. The fireplace had been recently cleared of ash, though the weather these past days has been mild enough to make a fire unnecessary. And there was a faint odour in the room, not unpleasant, not medicinal, which I could not immediately account for. He stopped. "I am a solicitor, Mr. Holmes. I deal in what can be proven, but I have spent 35 years in the study of human motive, and I tell you plainly that I do not believe Lady Fairleigh's death, in all its convenient timing, admits of easy explanation." I looked at Holmes. He had not moved, but the grey eyes had acquired that particular brightness which I had observed on so many previous occasions. The brightness not of excitement, which Holmes would have considered a vulgarity, but of engagement, of a mind finding purchase upon a problem. "Leave the document with me," said Holmes, "and kindly furnish Watson with the names and relationships of all those connected to the household. We shall attend upon you at Lincoln's Inn tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock, and thereafter proceed to Kensington." He rose, and the matter was apparently concluded. "One question before you go, Mr. Pembroke. The revised testament. the one Lady Fairleigh did not live to sign. In whose favour did it chiefly differ from the original? Pembroke stood and gathered his case. He hesitated for a moment before answering, and in that hesitation I thought I detected something. Not guilt, but a cousin of guilt. The discomfort of a man who knows more than he has yet chosen to say. It differed, said he at last, in that a substantial bequest which had previously been made to Colonel Basil Armitage was, i.e. in the revised version, entirely removed. He paused at the door. "Good evening, Mr. Holmes." "Good evening, Doctor." When he had gone, Holmes stood for a long moment looking at the closed door. Then he turned to the fire and held out both hands to its warmth, and I saw that the brightness had not left his eyes. "Well, Watson," said he quietly, "the fog thickens, in more respects than one. I believe we shall find this business a great deal more intricate than our friend the solicitor supposes." He reached for his pipe, "and a good deal more dangerous." Chapter 2. The Circle of Interest. The morning that followed our interview with Mr. Pembroke arrived without ceremony, the fog of the previous night having thinned to a grey, fine, undecided mist that hung above the rooftops of Baker Street, as though reluctant to commit to either departure or return. I breakfasted alone, Holmes having risen before me and occupied himself at his chemical bench with some experiment whose nature he declined to explain, and whose smell I found sufficiently disagreeable to discourage inquiry. By 9 o'clock he had washed his hands, exchanged his dressing gown for his coat, and was at the window with his pipe, apparently watching the street below with that quality of apparently idle attention, which was, as I had learned over many years, anything but idle. "You've been reading Pembroke's document," I observed, noting its position on the desk, shifted from where our visitor had placed it the night before. "I have been examining it," Holmes said, without turning. "There is a distinction. Reading implies the extraction of narrative. Examination implies something more surgical." He tapped the bowl of his pipe against his palm. "The paper is of high quality, the sort a careful solicitor would use for a document of this significance. The ink of the main body is consistent throughout. However, the marginal notation on the second page, a small asterisk and 3 words in what appears to be Lady Fairleigh's own hand, was written in a perceptibly different ink, bluer and slightly thicker. What do the 3 words say?" He turned from the window and smiled the thin, private smile that meant he was reserving judgment. "They say, 'Ask him why.' To whom the pronoun refers, and upon what subject the asking was intended, I cannot yet determine. But I find the phrase suggestive. A woman who writes 'Ask him why' in the margin of her own revised testament is a woman who harbours a specific suspicion and has not yet satisfied it." He replaced the document in its envelope. "Come, Pembroke will be expecting us." The offices of Pembroke, Gaines and Cathcart occupied a set of handsome if sober rooms in Lincoln's Inn, furnished with the deliberate plainness that prosperous solicitors favour as a signal of their trustworthiness. Pembroke received us in his private chamber, and within 20 minutes had furnished Holmes with a written summary of the household connected to the late Lady Fairleigh. Holmes folded the paper and placed it, unread, in his inside pocket, a habit of his which I had occasionally found maddening, and since he invariably proved to have absorbed its contents more completely than I could have managed with an hour's careful study. We proceeded thereafter to Kensington, where Fairleigh House presented itself as a property of quiet distinction, a late Georgian town-house set back from the street behind iron railings, its stonework clean, its windows dressed with curtains whose quality was visible even from the pavement. Whatever Lady Fairleigh's personal circumstances had been in her later years, the house at least maintained the outward dignity she had evidently prized. It was Mrs. Dalrymple who admitted us, a woman of 55 or thereabouts, stoutly built with a broad, honest face that was at present arranged in an expression of careful propriety, or as housekeepers of the old school arranged their faces when admitting strangers during a period of domestic grief. She had served Lady Fairleigh for, she informed us, 19 years, and she spoke the number with the quiet emphasis of one establishing credentials. "The family are in the drawing-room," said she. leading us along a corridor hung with portraits whose subjects regarded us with the uniform gravity of people who had sat for painters they found tiresome. Miss Clara arrived yesterday evening. Colonel Armitage called this morning. Dr. March I'm expecting within the hour. The drawing-room was a long, well-proportioned space decorated in the manner of 20 years previous, comfortable rather than fashionable, with deep chairs, heavy drapes, and the accumulated objects of a life well-travelled and attentively lived. 3 people rose as we entered. Miss Clara Fairleigh was younger than I had anticipated, perhaps 8 or 9 and 20, and possessed of a stillness of manner which, at that moment, I could not readily distinguish from composure or from the particular rigidity that sometimes accompanies suppressed distress. She was pale, with dark eyes that moved between Holmes and myself with swift, assessing intelligence, and she greeted us with a restraint that suggested she had been well schooled in the management of her own expression. She wore mourning with the neatness of someone who had arranged it carefully rather than hastily, which told me something of her character, though I was not then certain what. Colonel Basil Armitage occupied the chair nearest the window, and occupied it, I thought, with something of the unconscious authority of a man long accustomed to defining the space around him. He was a vigorous 60, broad across the shoulders, with close-cropped iron-grey hair and a moustache of the military variety, kept with the precision that military men of his generation regarded as a matter of personal honour. His manner toward us was cordial, in the practised way of a man who has hosted many strangers, and found that cordiality costs nothing and reveals nothing. His hands, I noticed, rested upon the arms of his chair with an openness I found, after a moment's reflection, slightly too deliberate. Dr. Edwin March arrived, as Mrs. Dalrymple had predicted, within the hour, and completed our circle. He was a slight, sandy-haired man of perhaps 50, with the mild and careful demeanour of a physician who has attended the same class of patient over many years and has learned the particular diplomacy such attendance requires. He shook our hands with a briskness that was, I thought, the briskness of a man wishing to convey that he was at ease, rather than the briskness of a man who actually was. Holmes spoke little during these introductions, which was itself a kind of statement. He stood at the edge of the room's social geometry, watching the 3 of them with the same quality of attention he had directed at the street from our Baker Street window, apparently unfocused, comprehensively absorbing. I had learned to perform my own function on these occasions, to engage the company in the sympathetic, the undemanding conversation of an old army doctor who had seen enough of life to put people at their ease, while Holmes conducted his silent inventory. Colonel Armitage spoke of Lady Fairleigh with the warm, unhurried affection of a man recounting a long friendship, and his anecdotes were fluent and detailed in a way that suggested they had been arranged in advance. Miss Clara answered my questions about her aunt's final days with careful precision, noting times and sequences with a conscientiousness that might, under other circumstances, have been admirable. Dr. March confirmed the cause of death in the measured, slightly formal language that physicians employ when they suspect their professional conclusions may later be examined, and stated that Lady Fairleigh's heart had been a source of concern for some 18 months. It was only when Holmes, with the air of a man making idle conversation, remarked that he understood Lady Fairleigh had intended to review some papers on the evening of her death, that something happened in that room, something brief and collective, like a single tremor passing through separate instruments. It was there and gone in a moment, the silence of 3 people deciding, each independently, not to look at the others. She often attended to correspondence in the evenings, said Miss Clara at last. Indeed, said Holmes pleasantly, a habit of orderly minds. He set down his teacup. One further thing. I understand the fireplace in her sitting-room was recently cleared. Cold work on a mild evening. I attended to that, said Mrs. Dalrymple from the doorway, where she had remained with the unobtrusive presence of a woman who considers it her right and duty to hear what is said under her mistress's roof. Lady Fairleigh preferred a clean grate. Holmes nodded, apparently satisfied. I was not satisfied, and I suspected Holmes was even less so. though nothing in his manner indicated it. On the pavement outside, as we waited for a cab, I fell into step beside him and said, in a low voice, that I had found all three of them remarkably composed for people who had recently lost someone close to them. "They are composed," Holmes agreed, raising his hand for a passing hansom. "The question which interests me, Watson, is whether they are composed because they are innocent, or because they have had 4 days to become so." He glanced back once at the house as we climbed in. "And there is a third possibility, of which I shall say nothing yet, but I will tell you this. The Colonel's hands lay upon those chair arms as though he had been instructed to place them there. Guilt folds its hands, innocence merely rests them." The cab pulled away into the Kensington traffic, and Holmes said nothing further for the remainder of the journey. Chapter 3. The Incident Reconsidered. We returned to Fairleigh House the following morning, this time by arrangement with Mrs. Dalrymple, who had been persuaded, not without a certain stiffness of manner that suggested she considered the intrusion an affront to the household's dignity, to grant us access to Lady Fairleigh's private sitting-room. Pembroke had smoothed the way with a brief letter invoking his authority as executor, and it was under that sanction that we mounted the stairs to the first floor while the housekeeper preceded us with the solemn tread of a woman conducting visitors through a cathedral. Inspector Gregson of Scotland Yard had been apprised of our involvement, as was customary, and met us on the landing with the expression he customarily reserved for Holmes, a compound of professional wariness and the reluctant acknowledgment that our presence, however irregular, had on previous occasions proven materially useful. He was a tall, fair man, capable enough in the ordinary run of his work, and sufficiently self-possessed to conceal the majority of his irritations. "The room has not been disturbed since we made our examination," said he, addressing Holmes with the manner of a man presenting credentials. "There was nothing to find, Mr. Holmes. Lady Fairleigh was elderly and her heart was unreliable. The physician confirms it, the death certificate states it, and I see no reason to complicate what is, in all essential respects, a straightforward matter." "Doubtless," said Holmes, already past him and through the door. I followed and found myself in a room of moderate size, orientated to the south, with 2 tall windows through which the late morning light fell upon furnishings of a retiring elegance. A writing desk of walnut positioned between the windows, a settee upholstered in faded damask, a low bookcase whose contents appeared to have been selected for use rather than display. The grate was cold and clean, as Dalrymple had confirmed. The air carried the particular quality of a room that has been closed and tidied, and from which the ordinary animation of daily occupation has departed. Holmes moved to the writing desk first, and I watched him as I have watched him on so many similar occasions, with the attentiveness of a man who knows that what he is observing will later require reconstruction from memory. He examined the surface of the desk without touching it, his body inclined forward and his hands clasped behind his back, bringing his face to within some inches of the leather inlay. He examined the pen in its stand, the ink bottle beside it, and the blotter, upon which he dwelt rather longer than I had expected. "The pen has been used recently," he said, "not to any of us in particular. The nib retains a residue of dried ink that has not yet become brittle. I should estimate it was used within the week. The ink bottle is uncapped." He straightened. Someone was preparing to write, or had been writing, and did not complete the act. The cap of the ink bottle was either forgotten, or the task was interrupted. Gregson cleared his throat. Or she uncapped it herself, felt unwell, and set it down. "That possibility retains its place among the others," Holmes conceded in the tone he used when he intended no such concession. He moved to the blotter. "You observed the sealing wax, Gregson?" "A smear near the lower right corner. Unremarkable." "Unremarkable?" Holmes regarded the blotter for another moment in silence. "Do you know, Inspector, I have always found that word to be among the most consequential in the English language. Things which are unremarkable have a particular talent for proving the reverse." He produced his lens from his coat pocket and applied it to the blotter's surface. "The wax is not a casual smear. It was not transferred from a passing sleeve or an incautious hand. It was deposited by an implement, a seal, pressed and then drawn sideways before the wax had fully hardened. He rose. Someone was sealing a document at this desk. The document is not here. I stepped to his side and looked, though my own unpractised eye could discern only what appeared to be a reddish-brown mark of no very definite shape. Holmes's interpretation of such things had long since ceased to astonish me, though it never entirely ceased to impress. He crossed to the fireplace next, and here he descended to one knee on the hearthrug with a disregard for his trousers that Mrs. Hudson would have lamented. The grate had been emptied and swept, but Holmes ran his fingers along the interior of the firebox with the deliberate thoroughness of a customs inspector, then examined the iron grate itself, the brick surround, and finally the narrow ledge beneath the flue. From this last location he withdrew, with the careful two-fingered delicacy of a man handling something he does not wish to disturb. A small, darkened fragment approximately the size of a visiting card, though irregular in shape and blackened at two of its edges. He carried it to the window and held it to the light. I moved to stand beside him. The fragment was the remnant of a heavier paper than correspondence paper, the kind employed for legal documents, and upon its unburned portion several words were visible in a clear professional hand. Holmes read them aloud, quietly. Revoke and make void all former. He turned the fragment over. The reverse bore only a partial word, the letters trick, and, below them, what appeared to be the upper half of a capital A. The standard phrasing of a revocation clause, I said, recognising it from the document Pembroke had shown us. That is from a will. From the will, Holmes said. He wrapped the fragment in his handkerchief with great care and placed it in his breast pocket. Gregson, I noticed, had come forward and was eyeing this proceeding with an expression that had revised itself somewhat from its earlier position. That may have come from any document, said he, though with less conviction than the words alone would imply. It may, said Holmes pleasantly, and yet it did not. He turned from the window and surveyed the room once more with the comprehensive, synthesizing look I had seen him employ at the conclusion of a physical examination, not searching for further detail, but confirming the arrangement of details already gathered. The fireplace was cleared hastily. A proper clearing would have removed all trace. This fragment was lodged behind the grate flange, out of reach of a domestic brush. Whoever cleared this fire did so quickly, and in the dark, or nearly so, and was not perfectly thorough. He paused. The fact that they troubled to clear it at all tells us a good deal more than the fragment itself. Why clear it at all, if the document was already burned? I asked. Because a burned document leaves an identifiable ash, said Holmes. Paper of this quality, in the quantity of a full testament, would leave an ash of considerable distinctive character. Fragments, perhaps, such as this one. The metal fastening of the document wallet which does not burn, the residue of the wax seal which melts but does not wholly disappear. A clear grate tells the casual observer that no fire was lit. An ash-filled grate with these constituents tells the careful observer exactly what was burned. He moved toward the door. Our adversary is not a fool, Watson. They are, however, a person of haste, and haste, in my experience, is always generous to the investigator. Gregson accompanied us to the landing, where he paused with his hat in his hands and the look of a man performing an internal calculation. "You believe the will was burned in that grate," he said. "I believe a document was burned in that grate," Holmes replied. Whether it was the will, a copy of the will, or a separate document connected to the will's contents, I cannot yet say with certainty. What I can say with certainty is this. He regarded Gregson steadily. Lady Fairleigh did not burn it. Gregson absorbed this. Then who did? "That question," said Holmes, descending the first step, "is precisely the one we're here to answer." We left Gregson on the landing with what I privately considered an adequate supply of material for reflection, and descended to the hallway where Mrs. Dalrymple waited with our hats, and the expression of a woman who has heard, through the particular acoustics of a tall house, rather more than she had been intended to hear. Holmes thanked her with a brevity that was not rudeness, and we passed out into the pale Kensington morning. On the pavement, I said to Holmes that I should very much like to know what he made of it all at this stage. He was quiet for a moment, watching a sparrow that had settled on the iron railing before us, with the self-possessed air of a creature that owns the street. "I make of it," he said at last, "that we're looking at the aftermath of a very composed mind acting under very uncomposed circumstances, the desk prepared, the fire laid, the document burned and the grate cleared, each action deliberate, each action individually explicable. Together they form a sequence, and sequences, Watson, have beginnings." He flagged a cab, and we proceeded back toward Baker Street without another word on the subject. Chapter 4. The First Contradictions. Holmes spent the remainder of that afternoon in a manner I had come to associate with the middle stage of an investigation, that period in which the initial impressions have been gathered and must now be tested against the resistance of human testimony. He sat at the desk in our Baker Street rooms with Pembroke's written summary before him, and a succession of pipes behind him, occasionally making a small notation in the margin of the document, and occasionally staring at the middle distance with the focused abstraction of a man solving an equation in his head. I occupied myself with correspondence and left him largely undisturbed, having learned long ago that interruption during this phase cost more than it contributed. By the following morning he had arranged for individual interviews with each member of the Fairleigh household circle, conducted at the house itself in the ground-floor parlour, with Mrs. Dalrymple's grudging cooperation and Gregson's rather more freely given permission. Holmes had suggested, and I had agreed, that I should conduct these interviews in the first instance, with Holmes present, but retired to a seat near the window, where his attention might appear less concentrated than it was. This arrangement had served us well on previous occasions. People speak more openly to a doctor than to a detective, and there is a quality to a physician's questions, framed as they are in the language of sympathy rather than suspicion, which tends to produce the unguarded remark that formal interrogation so reliably suppresses. "Doctor." March arrived first at 10 o'clock precisely, and settled himself into the parlour chair with the neat self-containment of a man who has ordered his nerves in advance. He was, in the daylight of a quiet room, somewhat more tightly wound than he had appeared during our initial meeting, and the sandy hair above his temples showed a pallor that I thought owed something to sleeplessness. I opened with the broad and sympathetic questions, the duration of his attendance upon Lady Fairleigh, the general nature of her health, the progress of the cardiac condition he had described. To these he responded with fluency and professional precision. He had attended her for 3 years. Her heart had shown signs of enlargement and irregular rhythm for the last 18 months. He had advised rest, a restricted diet, and the avoidance of distress or excitement. She had been, he said, a model patient, disciplined, unsentimental about her own condition, and entirely clear-sighted about its probable course. On the evening of her death, I said, in the tone of mild clinical curiosity, "I understand Lady Fairleigh had been intending to attend to some writing. Does that accord with your understanding of her state at that time?" A pause, brief but perceptible. "She was in no condition to exert herself at a writing desk," he said. "I had visited her that afternoon and found her fatigued. I advised complete rest. And yet the desk in her sitting-room was prepared for use," I observed, "ink uncapped, pen to hand." "I cannot account for that," said March. "I can only speak to what I observed and advised." At the window, Holmes had not moved, but his right hand, which had been resting open upon his knee, closed very slightly at the knuckle. I thanked Dr. March and moved the conversation elsewhere, and after a further 10 minutes he departed. Holmes waited until his footsteps had descended the front steps and said, without turning from the window, "He is lying about something, though not, I think, about everything. The question is which of his true statements he is using to frame his false one." "The desk," I said. "He told you she was too weak to write, yet the desk was prepared for exactly that purpose. One of those facts must yield to the other, but which?" He rose before I could answer. "Mrs. Dalrymple, if you please." The housekeeper was a more formidable subject than the doctor, yet in the way that people are formidable when their sense of loyalty is both genuine and entirely transferable. That is to say, she'd been devoted to Lady Fairleigh, and was now, in the absence of that fixed point, redirecting her devotion toward the preservation of the household's reputation, which she appeared to regard as very nearly the same thing. She sat opposite me with her hands folded in her lap, and her answers in good order. She confirmed the sequence of that final evening with the methodical precision of a woman who has rehearsed it. Lady Fairleigh had dined lightly at 7, had retired to her sitting room at past, had rung for nothing further, and had been found by Mrs. Dalrymple herself when she brought the evening cocoa at 10 o'clock, already beyond assistance. "The fire in the sitting room," I said. "You mentioned previously that you had cleared it. When did you do so?" "The morning after," she said, "as part of putting the room to rights." "It was cold when we examined it," Holmes said from the window, in the mild, conversational tone he employed when he did not wish to appear to be interrogating. "No ash, no residue, a thorough clearing." Mrs. Dalrymple turned toward him with the expression of a woman who has not forgotten he is there, regardless of where he has been sitting. "I am thorough in my work, Mr. Holmes. I always have been." "I don't doubt it. And yet the weather on the evening Lady Fairleigh died was, I understand, remarkably mild for the season. The other rooms in the house show no evidence of fires having been lit that evening. Why should her sitting room have been an exception?" The housekeeper was silent for 2 seconds. 2 seconds during which something moved across her broad, composed face that was not quite guilt and not quite knowledge, but occupied a region uncomfortably adjacent to both. "Lady Fairleigh felt the cold," she said at last. "More so in her later years." Holmes made a small sound that was not agreement and not contradiction, and Mrs. Dalrymple departed shortly afterward with the air of the woman who considers the interview to have concluded satisfactorily, and whom I suspected of being mistaken in that assessment. Colonel Armitage came last, and where the previous 2 had offered us the closed and careful courtesy of people managing their presentations, the Colonel offered us openness, an expansive and soldierly frankness that filled the room more completely than either of the others had managed, and which I found, the more it continued, the more studied it appeared. He spoke of Lady Fairleigh with warmth and ease, describing their acquaintance of some 30 years with the fluency of a man drawing on a well-prepared source. He expressed grief in the moderate, controlled register of his class and generation, and he answered every question I put to him with a directness that suggested he had nothing to conceal, and wished to make certain we appreciated the fact. When I asked him about the evening of Lady Fairleigh's death, he placed himself at his club until 9 o'clock, having dined there with 2 members he named without hesitation, and had retired early to his rooms in St. James's. He had heard nothing, seen nothing, and was as surprised as anyone, he said, by what the morning had brought. "You were close to Lady Fairleigh," I said. "Had you been aware of any alteration in her spirits or preoccupations in recent weeks?" "None whatsoever," he said. "She was exactly as she had always been." "She did not confide to you any concern arising from her past?" The question was gently posed, and I had been watching him as I delivered it. The change was small, a tightening at the corner of one eye, the faintest drawing together of the brows, a stillness in the hands that had been quite animated a moment before. It lasted less than 2 seconds, and he covered it with a frown of polite perplexity that was well enough executed. "I'm afraid I don't take your meaning, Doctor," said he. "I mean nothing particular," I said amiably. "Only that in my experience, people approaching the end of their lives sometimes find old matters acquiring a new urgency." "Lady Fairleigh," said the Colonel firmly, "was not a woman given to dwelling on the past." He left us shortly afterward, and the room seemed somewhat larger for his absence. I looked at Holmes. "Well?" I said. Holmes had his fingertips together. "The Colonel," he said deliberately, "did not ask us what we meant by her past. He told us she did not dwell on it. A man with nothing to conceal would have asked the question. A man who knows precisely what aspect of the past is under consideration tells you it was not significant." He paused. "And Dr. March lied about the desk or about her condition. One of the two. They cannot both be true." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said in a different tone, the tone of a man who has been carrying something patiently and now sets it down. "There is a third matter, Watson, which I have not yet raised, because I wished first to hear what each of them would choose not to tell us. The 2 pens. The 2 different inks in the testament document. The main body was drafted by Pembroke's clerk, but the final clause, the clause removing Armitage's bequest, was written in a different hand and a different ink." He rose and moved to the mantelpiece. Lady Fairleigh did not merely approve of that removal. She wrote it herself in her own hand and inserted it into Pembroke's draft. A woman does not take a pen to a solicitor's document on a whim. She does it because she has reached a conclusion she trusts no one else to reach for her. The fire ticked and settled. Outside, a cart moved along the street with the unhurried sound of ordinary commerce proceeding indifferent to the complications of the houses it passed. "She knew something about Armitage," I said. "She'd discovered something about Armitage," Holmes said, "which is not quite the same thing. Discovery implies a recent revelation, something that changed her view of what she had long believed." He picked up his pipe, and someone in that household knew she had discovered it, and acted before she could commit the knowledge to a signed and legal document. He said nothing further, and I sat with the weight of the implications settling around me like the London fog itself. Pervasive, unhurried, and cold. Chapter 5. The Testament That Was Not. There are investigations which proceed by sudden revelation, in which the decisive clue presents itself whole and unmistakable, like a landmark appearing through clearing weather. And there are others, the greater number, in my experience of Holmes's methods, which advance by the slower and more demanding process of reconstruction, in which the investigator must build the truth from fragments, the way a paleontologist assembles a vanished creature from scattered bone. The Fairleigh case was firmly of the second kind, and it was in the service of that reconstruction that Holmes spent the 2 days following our interviews in a concentrated industry that precluded conversation, discouraged company, and reduced our Baker Street rooms to a state of organised disorder that tried even my well-practised patience. Papers covered the desk and the floor around it. The fragment of burned document lay on the mantelpiece beneath Holmes's lens. Pembroke's testament, the incomplete one, had been unfolded and refolded so many times that its creases had acquired the soft, worn quality of a map in long use. Holmes moved between these materials with the absorbed restlessness of a man who cannot quite make the last piece of a thing behave as it should, and he ate almost nothing, which was his habit when his mind had taken full possession of him and reduced all bodily requirements to the status of interruptions. I passed the time usefully enough with my own affairs and waited, knowing from long experience that the interval between intense private reasoning and the moment Holmes chose to articulate his conclusions was rarely wasted, and that the conclusions themselves, when they came, were invariably worth the waiting. They came on the 3rd morning. I had breakfasted and was reading when Holmes set down the testament, turned from the desk and addressed me with the directness of a man releasing a pressure that has been building for some time. "Lady Fairleigh's final evening," he said, settling opposite me with his elbows upon his knees. "Let us reconstruct it, not as it was reported to us, but as the physical evidence compels us to conclude it occurred." I set aside my newspaper. She had the testament from Pembroke, the revised draft, incorporating the clause she herself had written removing Armitage's bequest. She intended to sign it in the morning, as she told Pembroke, but during the course of that evening something sharpened her resolve. Perhaps a conversation, perhaps the review of the document itself. Reading it once more and finding the removal of Armitage's name upon the page gave the thing a reality that had been, until that moment, theoretical. He paused, ordering his words with precision. She decided not to wait until morning. She uncapped the ink, she prepared the pen, and she took up the document with the intention of signing it that night. "But she did not sign it," I said. "She did not. The question is why? There are 2 possibilities. The first is that she suffered her cardiac event at that precise moment, at the desk, pen in hand, before the act was completed. The second is that she was prevented. He reached forward and lifted the fragment of burned paper from the mantelpiece in its handkerchief wrapping. The fragment tells us something important about which of those possibilities is correct. This paper, Watson, is not from the testament. I looked at him. But the legal phrasing is consistent with a will, yes. But the weight and texture of the paper differ from the testament Pembroke left with us. I have compared them with some care. This fragment is from a separate document, older, and drafted on the heavier paper stock that was in common professional use perhaps a decade or 15 years ago. He set it down again. Someone burned 2 documents in that fireplace. The Revised Testament, which was the document everyone knew about, and a second, older document, whose existence nobody has mentioned, and which someone considered it equally urgent to destroy. I absorbed this in silence. Outside, the street sounds of a Baker Street morning proceeded cheerfully indifferent to the gravity of what was being said inside our room. The sealing wax on the blotter, I said, remembering. Precisely. Lady Fairleigh was not sealing the testament. There would have been no cause to seal a document she was about to sign and present in the morning. She was sealing a letter or a separate packet, a communication she intended to send. Holmes rose and moved to the window in the familiar way, the movement of a man whose thoughts require a little more room than a chair allows. She had discovered something about Armitage, something sufficiently serious that it not only prompted her to rewrite her will, but also prompted her to write to someone, to document what she knew, or to act upon it in some way that went beyond the testament itself. And she sealed, or began to seal, that communication on the same evening. Then the sealing wax is not evidence of tampering, I said slowly. It is evidence of Lady Fairleigh's own intentions. Her intentions, yes, but the disturbance of the wax, the smear across the blotter, the seal pressed and then dragged, that is evidence of something else. A seal disturbed before it is fully set is a seal that was broken and re-examined. Someone opened what Lady Fairleigh had sealed. He turned from the window. Which means there was a third item in that room that evening, Watson, beyond the testament and the older document. A sealed letter or packet, and it too has vanished. The full shape of it was assembling itself in my mind with the slow, vertiginous certainty of a thing that, once seen, cannot be unseen. Lady Fairleigh had not simply been preparing to sign a document. She had been preparing in her careful, clear-sighted way to do several things at once, to alter her will, to expose whatever she had learned, and to ensure that the knowledge survived her signature and reached the appropriate quarter. She had been building a case. She knew she was unwell, I said. She was making certain that even if she did not live to sign the testament, the knowledge itself would not die with her. Holmes regarded me with the brief, undemonstrative approval he occasionally expressed when I followed his reasoning to a conclusion he had already reached. She was a thorough woman, he said. Pembroke described her to us as precise in her legal thinking. A woman of that character, facing both a serious revision of her estate and a serious revelation about a person she had trusted, would not leave the matter to a single instrument. She would provide for contingencies. He picked up his pipe, found it empty, and set it down again without apparent concern. The testament unsigned, the older document burned, the sealed letter vanished. 3 instruments, 3 destructions, and all of it accomplished between the moment of her death and the moment the household awoke the following morning. Which brings us back to who was in that house, I said. Who was in that house, and who among them had both the knowledge to identify what needed destroying and the composure to destroy it without leaving more trace than we have found? He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, so with the careful neutrality he employed when making a statement he was not yet prepared to support fully. The 2 inks in the testament remain the detail I find most instructive. Lady Fairleigh inserted that final clause herself in her own hand, without asking Pembroke to draft it. She did not dictate it to the solicitor. She wrote it herself, privately, after he had prepared the rest of the document. That is not the behaviour of a woman who trusted her solicitor with the full extent of what she knew. I looked up sharply. You mean she did not tell Pembroke the reason for removing Armitage? I mean she deliberately withheld it from him. Holmes's eyes were steady. She told him she wished to revise the will. She did not tell him why. She did not tell him what she had discovered. She kept the reason for the removal locked inside that final clause, written in her own hand, which she intended to seal inside a document she trusted to some other conveyance. He paused. Pembroke is the man who has brought this case to us. He is the man who has expressed concern, who has invoked propriety in the duties of his profession, and he is the man whom Lady Fairleigh did not trust with the whole truth. The thought required a moment to settle, and I confess it settled uncomfortably. You're not suggesting Pembroke is implicated, I said. Holmes reached again for his pipe and this time filled it from the Persian slipper, with the unhurried deliberation that meant he had arrived somewhere definite and was prepared to rest there. I am suggesting, said he, that we have been looking at this affair as a circle with Lady Fairleigh at its centre and the household arranged around her. I am now inclined to think the circle has a rather different geometry. He lit a match. There are motives here which we have not yet uncovered. There is a past which several people are guarding with more consistency than innocence requires, and there is, somewhere in this city, a sealed letter which Lady Fairleigh addressed to a recipient none of our witnesses have seen fit to mention. He drew on his pipe and let the smoke rise slowly in the still morning air. Tomorrow, he said, I think we must have a more direct conversation with Mr. Pembroke. Chapter 6. Shadows of the Past. We did not go to Pembroke the following morning. Holmes, in the intervening hours, had revised his sequencing, a habit of his which I had once found frustrating, and had long since come to recognise as the mark of a genuinely disciplined mind, one that preferred the discomfort of revision to the false comfort of premature certainty. Over breakfast he informed me, with the brevity brought to change plans, that before we confronted Pembroke directly we required a foundation of independent fact, and that a confrontation built upon inference alone gave the adversary too much room to manoeuvre. The solicitor, he said, turning a piece of toast in his fingers without eating it, is a man of legal training and long practice. He will not be undone by suggestion. He must be undone by a specific fact that he cannot explain away, and we do not yet have it. He set the toast down. We need to know what Lady Fairleigh discovered about Armitage, and we need to know it from a source that has nothing to do with the household. The past you mentioned, I said, the older document. The older document points backward in time. 15 years, if my reading of the paper stock is correct, which means we are looking for something that occurred 15 years ago, or thereabouts, and which has been dormant since. Dormant, but not inert. He pushed back from the table. I have a call to make this morning that does not require your company, Watson, though I hope to be back by early afternoon. In the meantime, I should be grateful if you would visit the reading room of the Army and Navy Club and consult the regimental records for Colonel Basil Armitage. Specifically, I want to know the dates and circumstances of his retirement. The Army and Navy Club, which I had occasion to visit rather more frequently during my years of bachelorhood than in my married life, received me with the comfortable familiarity of an institution that considers all former officers its natural constituency. The reading room was quiet at that hour, occupied only by two elderly gentlemen asleep in separate chairs, in the manner of men who have reached an age at which a club armchair and a volume of military history are all the ambition they require. The records clerk, a compact, helpful man named Jessup, who wore his own service somewhere in his bearing, located what I needed with efficient good nature. Now, Colonel Basil Armitage had retired from his regiment, the 2nd Battalion of a distinguished county infantry, in the autumn of 1879, some 17 years prior. His record was, on its surface, unimpeachable. Commendations in 2 campaigns, mention in dispatches, the steady upward progress of a capable and well-regarded officer. His retirement was listed as voluntary, at his own application, on grounds of private health. It was a phrase I had encountered before in military records, and it carried, as it almost always did, a certain practised vagueness that military administrators employed when the truth was something the record was not designed to accommodate. A man may retire on grounds of private health for a dozen reasons, of which actual ill health is only the most straightforward. I noted the date and the regimental designation, thanked Jessup, and was about to take my leave when a thought arrested me at the door. I turned back and asked, as mildly as I could manage, whether Jessup might be aware of any accounts from that period touching upon regimental financial matters. Not through any official channel, I assured him, but through the informal institutional memory that accumulates in a club of this kind over decades of membership. Jessup regarded me for a moment with the calibrated discretion of a man who has fielded this variety of inquiry before. He said that he personally could speak to nothing of that nature, but that a Colonel Fenwick, who had served in an adjacent battalion during the relevant period, and who was, as a matter of fact, one of the sleeping gentlemen in the leather chair by the second window, might conceivably be of assistance if approached with appropriate tact. I approached with what I hoped was appropriate tact, and Colonel Fenwick, once roused and offered the small stimulus of company, proved to be a man whose memory for the social and professional history of his era was both precise and, after a preliminary caution that I attributed to reflex rather than genuine reluctance, quite freely shared. He remembered Armitage. He remembered him well. And after a few minutes of the careful conversational navigation that these delicate historical inquiries require, he told me what he remembered. It amounted to this. In the late summer of 1879 there had been irregularities in the regimental mess accounts, not a small discrepancy of the kind that occasionally arose through careless administration, but a sustained pattern of falsification extending over several months and amounting, by the reckoning of those who investigated it privately, to a sum in excess of £400. The investigation had been conducted quietly, as these matters invariably were, by senior officers who had no appetite for public scandal and every interest in a discreet resolution. Armitage's name had been among those examined. No formal charge was ever brought. 3 weeks after the investigation concluded, Armitage applied for retirement on grounds of private health, and the regiment closed the matter permanently. Fenwick told me this without embellishment and without satisfaction, in the tone of a man recording history rather than prosecuting it, and he concluded by remarking that Armitage had subsequently lived very comfortably, far more comfortably in Fenwick's private opinion than the pension of a retired colonel of his seniority would straightforwardly account for. I returned to Baker Street to find Holmes already there, installed in his chair with a satisfaction of manner that told me his own morning had been productive before I had opened my mouth. "Sit down, Watson," said he, "and tell me about Armitage." I did so, delivering Fenwick's account in full while Holmes listened with his eyes half closed and the tips of his fingers pressed together in the attitude of careful reception. When I had finished, he was silent for a moment, and then he said, "Regimental funds, falsified accounts, a retirement arranged with notable haste." He nodded slowly. "That is consistent with what I found this morning, though it extends it considerably. What did you find?" I visited the offices of the Morning Post and spent an instructive 2 hours in their archive. Lady Fairleigh's late husband, Sir Reginald Fairleigh, was a man of considerable affairs, commercial, legal, and philanthropic. Among his philanthropic interests, in the early years of the 80s, was a charitable fund established for the benefit of the widows and orphans of military men. The fund received substantial contributions from several sources. He paused, and in the pause the conclusion arrived in my mind a half-second before he gave it voice. Armitage sat on the committee of that fund for 6 years. I sat with the weight of it settling. He falsified the regimental accounts, I said, and then, after his retirement, he continued the same practice through the charitable fund, a fund to which Lady Fairleigh's own husband was connected. Not merely connected, Sir Reginald was among its principal benefactors. Holmes unfolded a paper from his breast pocket, a set of notes in his compact, precise hand. He died in 1889. Lady Fairleigh inherited his papers, his correspondence, his financial records. All of it. And if, among those records, there was documentation of Armitage's conduct in relation to the fund, She would not necessarily have understood its significance at the time, I said. A widow settling her husband's affairs, sorting papers, filing correspondence. She might have preserved documents without knowing precisely what they contained. Until something prompted her to look at them again, Holmes agreed. A recent encounter, perhaps, a remark, the kind of small incident that sends a careful mind back to a half-remembered document with fresh eyes. He folded the paper away. Lady Fairleigh was, by every account, a woman of considerable intelligence and complete probity. When she understood what she had in her possession, she would have moved immediately, to her solicitor, to her will, and to whatever communication she had sealed that final evening. I thought of Armitage in the drawing-room, the practised openness, the hands arranged too deliberately upon the chair arms, the swift controlled suppression when I had asked about the past. He knew she'd found it out, I said. He knew, or he feared it strongly enough to act upon the fear. Holmes rose and moved to the mantelpiece, or where the burned fragment still lay in its handkerchief. He regarded it for a moment without touching it. But there remains a difficulty, Watson, and it is one I cannot yet resolve cleanly. Armitage was at his club that evening. 2 members can confirm it. He was not at Fairleigh House. He turned. Which means that if anything in that room was done by deliberate human agency, rather than mere natural misfortune, it was not done by Armitage's hand. The fire shifted in the grate. I heard Mrs. Hudson moving in the kitchen below, the ordinary domestic sounds of the afternoon proceeding around the extraordinary weight of what had been placed upon our consideration. Then someone acted on his behalf, I said. Holmes did not answer immediately. When he did, his voice carried the particular quality of a man who has reached a conclusion he finds not satisfying, but merely inevitable. Or, he said quietly, someone acted in the protection of interests which happened, on this occasion, to coincide with Armitage's own. He said nothing further, and I knew better than to press him. Chapter 7. The Obvious Culprit. Inspector Gregson arrived at Baker Street on the Thursday morning without prior notice, and with the bearing of a man who has resolved a difficulty and wishes the resolution acknowledged. He was shown up by Mrs. Hudson, and accepted a chair and a cup of tea with the ease of someone who considers himself on this occasion to be delivering news rather than seeking it. "I thought you ought to know," said he, addressing Holmes with the careful balance of collegial courtesy and institutional authority that senior Scotland Yard men employed when consulting private individuals they would have preferred not to need, that the matter of Lady Fairleigh has taken a definite turn. We have made an arrest. Holmes, who had been standing at the mantelpiece reading a letter, set it down with a deliberateness that was not quite surprise and not quite its opposite. "Have you?" he said. "Miss Clara Fairleigh was taken into custody yesterday evening?" Gregson set his cup upon the side table and produced a small notebook, though I noticed he did not open it. The gesture of a man who has his facts sufficiently in hand but wishes to signal their official character. "The evidence, Mr. Holmes, is circumstantial in parts, but collectively rather persuasive. I will lay it out for you plainly." He did so. Miss Clara had been alone with her aunt for a period of approximately 40 minutes on the evening of Lady Fairleigh's death, between 8:30 and shortly after 9 o'clock, a fact she had not volunteered during her initial interview, and which had emerged only through subsequent questioning of Mrs. Dalrymple. A vial of digitalis solution, consistent with a preparation somewhat stronger than the concentration Dr. March had prescribed, had been discovered in a small travelling case in Miss Clara's room during a search conducted the previous afternoon. Miss Clara had offered no satisfactory explanation of the vial's presence, stating only that it was not hers and that she could not account for how it had come to be among her possessions. She had been, in Gregson's measured description, agitated throughout the interview to a degree that he considered inconsistent with the measured composure she had displayed on all previous occasions. Furthermore, Gregson continued, her financial circumstances are considerably less comfortable than the family connection might suggest. She has debts, Miss Fairleigh, not ruinous but pressing, and of a kind that the inheritance she stood to receive under the original will would have resolved at a stroke. He closed the notebook he'd never opened. The revised testament, had it been signed, would not have altered her position materially. The principal bequest to Miss Clara was unchanged, but there is reason to believe she was aware her aunt intended to make additional changes beyond those Pembroke drafted, and that those further changes might have affected her significantly. Holmes had not moved throughout this recitation. He stood at the mantelpiece with his arms folded and his gaze upon the middle distance, and in his expression I read something that I had learned over many years to distinguish from indifference. It was the focused neutrality of a man who is listening not to what is being said, but to the architecture of what is being said, noting its proportions and its weight-bearing points. "The vial," Holmes said at last. "Where precisely in her travelling case was it found?" "In the interior pocket, beneath a folded handkerchief." "Folded? Yes. Not loose, not wrapped around the vial, simply folded and placed with the vial beneath it." Holmes turned from the mantelpiece. "And the vial itself, sealed or open?" Gregson consulted his memory rather than his notebook. Sealed. The stopper was in place. Had any of the contents been used? A fractional hesitation. The vial appeared full, or nearly so. "Nearly so," Holmes repeated quietly. He moved to his chair and sat, crossing his legs with the unhurried air of a man settling into a problem rather than out of one. "Gregson, I will not tell you that Miss Clara is innocent, because I am not yet in a position to make that statement with the certainty it would require. I will tell you, however, that the evidence as you have described it presents a difficulty which I think you have not yet fully considered." Gregson's expression suggested he had anticipated this, and had decided to receive it with equanimity. "Go on." "Why then, a woman who administers poison does not preserve the remaining supply in a sealed vial in her own travelling case. She destroys it, or removes it from the premises, or at the very minimum conceals it in a location less directly associated with her person. The presence of that vial in that location suggests one of two things. Either Miss Clara is a person of extraordinary nerve and negligence simultaneously, a combination I find psychologically improbable, or the vial was placed there by someone else." "She could have panicked," said Gregson. "People do." "They do," Holmes agreed. "But panic of the preserving kind, where a dangerous piece of evidence is retained and hidden rather than discarded, is peculiar to people who either cannot bear to relinquish the means of an act they are not yet certain was necessary, or who cannot safely dispose of it elsewhere. Neither circumstance applies readily to Miss Clara. She was at liberty for 4 days before your search. She had ample opportunity to remove it." He paused. "And there is the question of the digitalis concentration itself. You said it was stronger than Dr. March's prescribed preparation. How much stronger?" Gregson did not know precisely, and said so. "I should like that established before you proceed further," said Holmes. "The strength of the preparation will tell us a great deal about its provenance." Gregson accepted this with the expression of a man filing a note he will attend to at his own convenience, and shortly afterward took his leave with the manner of someone who has shared more than he intended to, and received less satisfaction from it than he had hoped. When his footsteps had descended the stair, I turned to Holmes. I will confess that I did not at that moment share his detachment. The case against Miss Clara, as Gregson had laid it out, had the uncomfortable quality of sufficient evidence, not overwhelming, not elegant, but adequate. The financial motive was documented. The opportunity was established. The physical evidence, however clumsily it might have been planted, was present. I had sat with her in that Kensington drawing-room and found her composed, guarded, and, I now thought, in the revised light of Gregson's account, nervous in a way I had attributed to grief but might equally have attributed to other causes. "You believe she's innocent," I said, though it emerged as something between a statement and a question. Holmes regarded me with the brief, assessing look he occasionally directed at me when my scepticism pleased him. "I believe the evidence against her was assembled," he said. "Whether it was assembled by nature and coincidence, or by a deliberate hand, is the question." He steepled his fingers. "Consider the architecture of it, Watson. The vial appears at precisely the moment the investigation is gaining momentum, in precisely the location most likely to be searched, preserved in a condition that suggests it was never used for its ostensible purpose. The opportunity, the 40 minutes alone with her aunt, is a fact that was withheld from us initially, which might argue concealment, but which was, when it emerged, verifiable and verified. A truly calculating person conceals what cannot be established. She concealed what Mrs. Dalrymple could confirm at any moment. Unless she relied on Dalrymple's loyalty not to confirm it. An interesting point, and one I credit you with fully. He inclined his head slightly. It is possible. It is also possible that her agitation during questioning was the agitation of an innocent person who finds herself in the position of being unable to explain what she cannot explain. That state is not comfortable, and it does not produce composure. I sat with this, turning it as I might turn an object in my hands to examine it from different angles. The room was quiet. Mrs. Hudson moved below with her customary dependable rhythm. Holmes was looking at the ceiling in the manner that meant he was not looking at it at all. "The digitalis," I said, after a moment, approaching it from the angle of my medical training rather than my lay judgment. If it is considerably stronger than March's prescribed concentration, it was not obtained through the ordinary pharmaceutical channels that would have served Miss Clara. It was prepared by someone with clinical knowledge of the required dosage. Holmes brought his gaze down from the ceiling and fixed it upon me, with the sudden attentiveness of a man in whom a thought has just confirmed itself. "Or by someone who knew the prescribed dosage," he said, "and knew precisely how far beyond it was required." He rose abruptly and moved to the desk. "Watson, I owe you an apology for having failed to pursue that line earlier, and I owe Miss Clara Fairleigh the debt of considerably greater urgency." He pulled his coat from the hook beside the door. "We're going to see Dr. March. Now, if you please, and without ceremony." We were on the pavement in under 2 minutes, and Holmes flagged a cab with the sharp economy of a man who has already calculated how much time remains before the matter becomes irreversible. Chapter 8. The Single Detail. Dr. Edwin March occupied rooms in a quiet residential street in Marylebone, the kind of address that communicates professional respectability without ostentation, a first-floor flat above a chemist's shop, reached by a separate entrance at the side of the building, and announced by a modest brass plate that had been polished to the precise degree a careful man polishes things he wishes noticed without appearing to have been noticed. Holmes took in the plate, the entrance, and the first-floor window in a single upward glance as we descended from the cab, and said nothing. The housekeeper who admitted us was a thin, elderly woman of the imperturbable variety, who regarded unexpected callers with the same neutral expression she might have applied to expected ones, and she showed us into a small waiting room furnished with the predictable appointments of a physician's domestic consulting space. A bookcase, 2 wooden chairs, a table carrying medical journals 3 months out of date, while she went to inform Dr. March of our presence. He kept us waiting for perhaps 4 minutes, long enough, I reflected, to compose himself, but not so long as to suggest that composition required particular effort. When he appeared in the doorway, he was in his working coat, and he greeted us with the careful cordiality of a man who has decided that cordiality is the correct instrument for this particular occasion, and is deploying it with precision. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, I was not expecting you, but you're very welcome." He gestured us toward the consulting room. "I have heard about Miss Fairleigh's arrest. A dreadful business." "Dreadful," Holmes agreed pleasantly, taking the chair nearest the desk without waiting to be invited. "I should like to speak with you about the digitalis, March." The name of the drug produced in the physician's expression an alteration so slight that I am not certain I should have registered it, had I not been watching for it with the attention Holmes had put me in the habit of bringing to these moments. It was not alarm, and it was not guilt in any theatrical sense. It was the minute tightening of a man who's been anticipating a question, and now finds it in the room with him. "The digitalis prescribed for Lady Fairleigh," March said, settling into his own chair with measured ease. "A standard preparation, I have given my account of it to Gregson's people already. You have, said Holmes. You told them the concentration you prescribed. What I should like to know is the concentration you prepared. A silence of 3 seconds, which in the context of that quiet room was a silence of some duration. March's hands, which had been resting comfortably upon the arms of his chair, shifted fractionally. I prescribed a standard therapeutic dose, he said. The preparation was made up by the pharmacist to my specification. I am sure it was. Holmes crossed his legs with an ease that sat in deliberate contrast to the quality of the air between them. I am also sure that you, as a physician of 30 years' experience with cardiac patients, maintain in these rooms a supply of digitalis preparations at various concentrations for use in acute situations where a pharmacist is not immediately accessible. It is common practice, and perfectly sensible. He paused. The vial found in Miss Fairleigh's travelling case contained a concentration approximately 3 times the therapeutic dose you prescribed. A pharmacist filling a standard prescription would not prepare such a concentration. A physician maintaining an emergency supply, however, might. March said nothing. The clock on his desk marked the interval with small, unhurried strokes. I want to be precise with you, Holmes continued, in the tone of a man who considers precision a form of courtesy, because precision is what this situation requires. I am not asking you to incriminate yourself. I am asking you to consider very carefully what the provenance of that vial tells us about how it came to be in Miss Fairleigh's room, and whether the answer to that question is one you are content to allow to stand as the basis of a criminal prosecution against an innocent woman. It was at this point that I saw something shift in March. Not the controlled surface shift he'd been managing throughout the interview, but something deeper, more fundamental, the movement of a weight that has been carried at some cost and has now, at the particular pressure of the moment, exceeded what can be borne silently. He looked at his hands. He looked at Holmes. He looked briefly at me, and I held his gaze with the steady, non-judgmental attentiveness that I had learned, in my years of practice, will sometimes say what no spoken reassurance can. "The vial is mine," he said at last, in a voice from which the careful professional register had quietly departed. Or was mine. I did not place it in Miss Fairleigh's case, and I did not administer its contents to Lady Fairleigh. I want that clearly understood. "Understood," said Holmes. "When did you last see it?" March pressed his hands together and leaned forward. "I maintain a case, a small leather case of emergency preparations. It is kept in the cabinet there." He indicated the cabinet behind the desk without turning. 4 days before Lady Fairleigh's death, I attended her as usual. I had the case with me, as I always do on house calls. I left it in the hallway while I examined her, as the staircase at Fairleigh House is narrow, and I customarily leave it on the hall table rather than carry it up. He stopped. When I returned to collect it, it had been moved, not by much, perhaps 6 inches along the table, no more. I assumed Mrs. Dalrymple had shifted it in passing. I thought nothing further of it until this morning, when I conducted an inventory of the case and found the emergency digitalis vial absent. Holmes was perfectly still. "You're certain it was there before that visit?" "I checked the case the morning of that visit. It is my practice." The vial was present." "And you said nothing of this to Gregson?" A pause that contained within it a quantity of things March was not prepared to say directly. "I feared," he said at last, with the quiet difficulty of a man making an admission his professional pride is reluctant to permit, "that the missing vial would appear to implicate me. I was the attending physician. The concentration matches my emergency supply. I could not account for its disappearance without implicating myself in the very avenue of suspicion I wished to avoid." He looked up. "I know how that sounds." "It sounds like the reasoning of a frightened man who is not guilty," Holmes said, without unkindness. "Which has a regrettable tendency to produce the behaviour of a guilty one." He rose. "I shall need a written statement of everything you have told me, signed and dated. Not for Gregson, not yet, for my own use. Can you furnish it within the hour?" March said that he could, and Holmes moved to the window while the physician prepared himself. looking out at the Marylebone Street with his hands clasped behind him. I came to stand beside him, and he spoke to me in a voice calibrated for my ears alone. "The hallway at Fairleigh House," I said quietly. "Any one of them could have passed through it during that visit." "Any one of them," Holmes agreed. "But consider the knowledge required, Watson, to recognise a physician's emergency case, to identify among its contents the correct preparation, to understand what concentration would serve a particular purpose, and yet leave the primary evidence of cause, a failed heart, undisturbed." He watched a cart making its way along the street below. "That is not a layperson's knowledge. That is the knowledge of someone familiar with clinical preparations and their effects." "March himself," I offered. "Remains possible," Holmes said. "His account is self-serving in its present form, and I have not yet verified it. But there is another person in this case who has spent a professional lifetime in the management of Lady Fairleigh's legal and personal affairs, who would have been intimately acquainted with her medical history, who attended that house on numerous occasions and would have known precisely where a visiting physician's case was left unattended." He paused. "A solicitor who carries documents to elderly clients is not so very different in the domestic arrangement of a house from a physician who carries a medical case. Both are shown in, both set their bags down, and both are sometimes left in a hallway while the household attends to other matters." I looked at him. "Pembroke?" "The hallway at Fairleigh House," Holmes said again, as though weighing it. "And now the sealing wax." He said it in the tone of a man for whom two unconnected things have just resolved themselves into a single shape. The quiet, almost private tone that I had come to regard, over all our years together, as the sound of the case turning. He turned from the window as March returned with the written statement, took it, read it with the rapid attention he brought to documents, folded it precisely, and placed it inside his coat. He thanked March with the crisp sincerity of a man whose gratitude is genuine and whose time is limited, and we were back on the pavement within minutes. The afternoon had turned cold, and the sky above Marylebone had the flat, pewter quality of a London sky considering rain. "The wax," I said as we walked. "Lady Fairleigh sealed her letter," Holmes said, "and someone opened it after her death. Only a person with a reason to intercept that specific communication, a person who knew or feared what it contained, would have opened it, and only a person who understood the legal implications of its contents would have known that destroying it, along with the testament, was the essential act." He flagged a cab at the corner. Armitage had the motive and the past, but Armitage was at his club. The person in that house, with access to the document, with the legal knowledge to understand what needed to be destroyed, and the clinical adjacency to understand how a physician's case might be put to use. That person is not Armitage. He held the cab door open and looked at me with the expression of a man who has followed a chain of reasoning to its final link and found it holds. "Tomorrow," he said, "we conclude this." Chapter 9. The Deduction. Holmes sent 4 notes that evening. I was not shown their contents, but I observed him writing them at the desk with the swift, economical hand he used when the matter was settled in his mind, and required only its physical execution, and I noted that he dispatched them by 4 separate messengers within the space of 30 minutes. One went to Gregson. One, I later learned, went to Pembroke, one to Fairleigh House, and one to an address in St. James's which I did not then recognise but subsequently understood to have been Armitage's rooms. He then ate a full dinner for the first time in 3 days, smoked 2 pipes in companionable silence, and went to bed at 11 o'clock, which was itself sufficient indication that the thing was, in his own estimation, complete. I slept less well than he did. The following morning was clear and cold, with the bright, thin quality of November light that makes London look briefly like a city that has been washed and set out to dry. We took a cab to Kensington at 9:30, and Holmes was silent throughout the journey in the particular way he was silent before a final confrontation. Not the abstracted silence of unresolved thought, but the settled, inward quiet of a man who has made his preparations and is waiting for the appointed moment with neither impatience nor particular relish. The drawing-room at Fairleigh House had been arranged at Mrs. Dalrymple's direction, with sufficient chairs for the company Holmes had summoned. They were already assembled when we arrived, Gregson standing near the door with the careful posture of a man who's been asked to attend a proceeding. He is not organised, and is reserving his opinion of it. Colonel Armitage in the chair he had occupied during our first visit, this time with an expression from which the practised cordiality had entirely withdrawn, leaving something harder and more watchful in its place. Dr. March, pale and upright in a chair near the window, his hands upon his knees with the rigid stillness of a man maintaining composure by act of will. Mrs. Dalrymple at the room's periphery, standing rather than sitting, as though her sense of domestic position prevented her from placing herself on an equality with the assembled company even under these circumstances. Pembroke was the last to arrive, and he came in with the same measured self-possession he had brought to our Baker Street rooms 10 days before. The upright carriage, the composed face, the leather case under his arm from which he was, it seemed, inseparable. He greeted Holmes with a brief nod, took a chair slightly apart from the others, and set the case upon his knee with both hands resting upon it in a manner that might, to a careless observer, have appeared perfectly natural. Holmes stood before the fireplace. Around there was nothing theatrical in his manner, no deliberate staging of effect. He spoke as he habitually did when delivering a final account, clearly, precisely, and with the dispassionate focus of a man whose object is not to impress but to illuminate. "I shall proceed directly," he said, "because Miss Clara Fairleigh is in custody on a charge that does not stand, and the correction of that error is the most urgent business before us. I shall also proceed directly because several of you in this room have spent the past 10 days expending considerable energy on misdirection, and I do not propose to reward that energy with more of your time than the facts require." Armitage shifted in his chair. Gregson's expression recalibrated slightly. "Lady Fairleigh died of cardiac failure," Holmes continued. "I want that stated without equivocation, because it is true, and because the confusion surrounding the manner of her death has been one of the instruments by which the real crime in this affair has been obscured. She was not murdered. She died as her physician predicted she eventually would, and the tragedy of the evening is not that someone killed her, but that someone used the fact of her dying to commit a different crime entirely, the crime of suppressing what she had discovered and of destroying the instruments by which she intended that knowledge to survive her." He let that settle for a moment, and the room was quiet enough that I could hear, faintly, the street sounds of Kensington through the closed windows. Lady Fairleigh had uncovered evidence of a long-standing financial deception, Holmes said. Colonel Armitage, during his time on the committee of the charitable fund established by her late husband, diverted a substantial sum from that fund over a period of several years, employing the same methods he had used and been quietly required to abandon during his military service. Lady Fairleigh found the documentation among her husband's papers, perhaps recently, perhaps prompted by a remark or encounter that directed her attention to records she had preserved without fully examining. The documentation was sufficient to ruin Colonel Armitage entirely, and she knew it. Armitage said nothing. His face had the set, stonework quality of a man who has decided that silence is his remaining instrument and intends to use it fully. She acted with the thoroughness of a precise and resolute woman, Holmes continued. She summoned her solicitor and revised her will, removing Armitage's bequest and inserting in her own hand the revocation clause. She retained the incriminating documents in her possession. And on the evening of her death she prepared 2 additional things: a sealed communication directed to a party outside the household, the contents of which I believe detailed Armitage's conduct and identified the documentary evidence supporting it, and she appears to have intended to sign the testament that same night rather than waiting until morning, as though some instinct advised her that morning might be too late. Holmes turned slightly, and his gaze settled upon Pembroke with the calm, impersonal quality of a conclusion that has no need of drama to sustain it. She died before she could sign. and that is where the crime begins, not with Lady Fairleigh's death, but with what was done in this house in the hours that followed it. Pembroke had not moved. His hands remained upon the leather case with the same even pressure. His face was the face of a man attending a legal proceeding in which he is professionally confident of his position, composed, attentive, and giving nothing. The testament was unsigned, Holmes said. The incriminating documents were in the room. The sealed letter was on the desk. And you, Mr. Pembroke, were informed of Lady Fairleigh's death by early the following morning as executor of the estate. You came to the house. You were admitted, offered condolences, and left, as executors are, to attend to the immediate formalities. In the course of those formalities, you had access to the sitting room, he paused. You burned the incriminating documents in the grate, and you cleared the grate thereafter. You opened the sealed letter, read its contents, and removed it. You took the unsigned testament and, rather than destroying it, returned it to a form that would serve your interests and Armitage's, preserving the original will that named him as a beneficiary and representing the unsigned revision as simply a draft that had never been executed. Gregson had straightened perceptibly. March was staring at the floor. Why, I asked, because the question had been forming in me since the previous evening, and Holmes had invited this moment for exactly that purpose. Would Pembroke protect Armitage? Holmes did not look at me, but he answered me. Because Pembroke has been protecting Armitage for 30 years. The quiet resolution of the regimental inquiry, the one that required no formal charge and produced only a resignation, was managed by a junior solicitor who was, at that time, building a career and doing favours for men whose connections were worth acquiring. That solicitor was Alistair Pembroke. He let the silence hold for a moment. Armitage did not pay him for that service in money. He paid him in something more durable, a debt of complicity, quietly acknowledged and quietly renewed across 3 decades, until the accumulated weight of it had made both men hostages of the other's continued silence. Pembroke spoke for the first time. His voice was steady, and I noted with an unwilling respect that steadiness, because it required considerable inner resources to maintain under the combined weight of what had just been said and the eyes that were now upon him. "This is a very ingenious account, Mr. Holmes," he said. "I shall want to know what evidence you propose to bring in support of it." 3 pieces, said Holmes, with the brevity of a man who has been waiting for precisely that question. The burned fragment, which is paper consistent with Sir Reginald's correspondence files, and inconsistent with any document originating in your office. The disturbed sealing wax, which demonstrates that a sealed document was opened in that room by a person who had a reason to open it. And the vial of digitalis, which was taken from Dr. March's case during a visit to this house 4 days before Lady Fairleigh's death, not for use, but for planting, taken and held in reserve to provide at the appropriate moment a direction for suspicion that would serve to draw investigators away from the sitting room and everything it contained. He looked at Pembroke directly. "You took it, Mr. Pembroke, on that afternoon visit to attend to papers with Lady Fairleigh, the visit at which she told you she wished to revise the will, and during which you understood, for the first time, the nature of what she had found. You took it not knowing yet how it would be used, but understanding that a charge against Miss Clara, if it became necessary, would redirect both Gregson and myself entirely." He paused. It nearly did. The room was completely still. Then Armitage made a sound that was not quite a word, and Pembroke raised one hand toward him in a gesture of swift, a final prohibition, and the sound stopped. What followed was not a confession in the theatrical sense. It was something quieter and, in its way, more terrible. The incremental yielding of a man whose defences have been removed one by one with such precision that the final position is simply insupportable. Pembroke set his leather case upon the floor beside the chair. He looked at Holmes for a long moment, and then he said, in a voice that had relinquished its professional register entirely, that he had not intended that any harm should come to Miss Clara, and that he had believed the charge would not hold. "It is not murder," he said. "I want that clearly understood. I destroyed documents, and I removed a letter, and I placed the vial in her case. Those are the facts of what I did." "Those facts," said Gregson, who was stepping forward with the quiet authority of a man who has been waiting for the right moment, "will be sufficient for a beginning." Holmes moved from the fireplace and came to stand beside me, and we watched Gregson administer the necessary formalities with the competent, unhurried manner of a detective who has been handed a conclusion he did not fully earn, and has the good grace not to pretend otherwise. Armitage sat in his chair throughout, saying nothing, with the expression of a man watching a wall collapse that he had believed was sound, and had trusted to remain standing for the rest of his life. As we passed into the hallway, Mrs. Dalrymple stood at the foot of the stairs with her hands folded before her and her broad face arranged in an expression I had not previously seen upon it. Not composure, not propriety, but the very particular look of a woman who has served a house faithfully and has just understood that the house had more secrets than she was given to know. She said nothing as we passed, and I offered her the small acknowledgment of a brief nod, which she returned with a dignity that I thought said more than either of us could comfortably have put into words. On the pavement, Holmes turned up his collar against the cold, and looked once at the house before we walked on. "She was a remarkable woman," he said, and I understood that he meant Lady Fairleigh, and that the remark was as close to an epitaph as Sherlock Holmes was likely to offer anyone. We walked together in silence toward the corner where a cab was waiting, and the bright, cold morning received us without comment. Chapter 10. The Quiet Resolution. Justice. Or, in my experience of it through many years of association with Sherlock Holmes, is rarely the clean and satisfying thing that the popular imagination requires it to be. It does not arrive with trumpets. It does not restore what was lost or repair what was broken. It establishes, with the imperfect instruments available to it, a reckoning. And the reckoning, when it comes, is almost always smaller and quieter than the crime that occasioned it, in the way that the resolution of a long illness is quieter than the fever that preceded it, and leaves the patient diminished and the room somehow less charged than it was. The legal proceedings against Alistair Pembroke occupied the better part of 6 weeks, and generated in legal terms a charge of obstruction, suppression of testamentary documents, and the fraudulent preservation of a superseded will. It was not murder, as Pembroke had been at pains to establish, and no charge of murder was brought, for the simple reason that Lady Fairleigh had died, as her physician said she had died, of a heart that had been failing for the better part of 2 years, and which had simply, on that particular evening, failed entirely. The digitalis vial, it was established, had never been opened. Whatever Pembroke had contemplated in taking it from March's case, contemplation was the furthest extent to which it had progressed, and the law, which concerns itself with acts rather than intentions, could reach him only so far. He was convicted on the charges brought and sentenced accordingly. I will not record the specific terms, and partly because they are a matter of public record for those who wish to consult it, and partly because the sentencing itself struck me, when I attended the proceedings, as less significant than the quality of the man who received it. Pembroke stood in the dock with the same upright composure he had carried into our Baker Street rooms on that November evening. The same controlled face, the same precise hands, and he received the sentence with the formal acknowledgment of a man who has been in courts of law for 35 years and understands their procedures, their gravity, and their limitations, and who does not propose to dignify them with visible emotion. I confess I did not know what to feel watching him. He had obstructed the course of an innocent woman's justice. We had permitted Miss Clara Fairleigh to sit in custody on a charge he had himself manufactured, and had spent 30 years in the active maintenance of a deception that had deprived charitable funds, and by extension the widows and orphans those funds were designed to serve, of money that was rightfully theirs. These are not minor things, and yet the man in the dock was not, in any obvious way, the villain of simpler narratives, not cruel, not venal in the ordinary sense, not even, I thought, primarily selfish. He was a man who had made a single accommodation of his principles very early in his career, and had spent the subsequent decades paying its compounding interest, until the debt had grown so large that its concealment had become the organising project of his professional life. That is a species of tragedy as well as a species of crime, and the law, appropriately, concerns itself only with the latter. Colonel Armitage's situation was more complex and in its resolution considerably less satisfying. The records of the charitable fund, once examined with the attention Holmes had directed toward them, established a pattern of falsification sufficiently clear to warrant formal inquiry. The fund had been wound up some years previously, its remaining assets distributed, and the principal benefactors were either deceased or, in the case of Lady Fairleigh's estate, represented by executors appointed after Pembroke's removal. The legal avenues by which Armitage might have been prosecuted were narrow, and, as the solicitors appointed to examine the matter eventually concluded, not sufficiently navigable to guarantee conviction. He was not charged. He resigned from his clubs. He withdrew from the small circuit of social engagements that had constituted his London life. Holmes informed me some months later, and without particular emphasis, that Armitage had removed himself to the continent, to an address in Switzerland that suggested the comfortable self-exile of a man with adequate resources, and the wish to place a significant quantity of geography between himself and his recent history. Whether that constitutes justice is a question I am not qualified to answer, and I note only that Holmes, when I raised the matter, was silent for a moment before observing that the removal of a man from everything he values is not, strictly speaking, an insignificant punishment, even when administered by circumstance rather than a court of law. Miss Clara Fairleigh was released from custody within 24 hours of Gregson receiving Holmes's account, and the charge against her was formally withdrawn within the week. She came to Baker Street on the afternoon following her release, and I received her in our sitting room while Holmes, characteristically, remained at his bench in the back room and left the social dimension of the matter to me. She was pale and carried herself with the particular combination of exhaustion and relief that I had seen in patients emerging from extended distress, and she thanked me with the composed brevity of a woman who is aware that elaborate expression of gratitude would cost her the composure she was working to maintain. I told her that Holmes had done what needed to be done, and that the important thing was that it was done. She asked before she left whether she might speak to Holmes directly. I went to the back room and conveyed the request. Holmes set down his work, came to the doorway, and regarded her for a moment with a considering, impersonal attention that was simply his natural expression, and which I had long since understood he could no more moderate than he could moderate the colour of his eyes. "You knew," she said quietly, "from early in the investigation that I was not guilty." "I knew from early in the investigation," Holmes replied, "that the evidence against you had been assembled rather than discovered. That is not quite the same thing, though the distinction becomes academic in retrospect." He paused. "Your aunt was a courageous woman, Miss Fairleigh. She acted with complete clarity in circumstances that would have paralysed many people, and she came very close to succeeding. It is a pity that the courage of private individuals is so frequently required to do the work that public institutions fail to accomplish in time." It was for Holmes an unusually direct acknowledgement of something other than the purely intellectual dimensions of the case, and I saw Miss Clara register it as such. She nodded once and took her leave, and we heard her descend the stair and the door close behind her below. Holmes returned to his bench without comment, and I sat in my chair by the window and looked out at Baker Street in the afternoon light, thinking about Lady Fairleigh at her desk on that final evening, the pen in her hand, the documents before her, the careful intelligence of a woman making certain that what she knew would outlive the frailty of the body that contained it. She had not quite succeeded. The instruments she had prepared had been taken from her in the hours after her death, and the knowledge she had committed to paper had been committed to the fireplace grate instead. And yet the act itself, the decisive, clear-sighted act of a woman who understood what she possessed and what it obligated her to do, had been the essential thread. Without it, there would have been no Pembroke at our door. Without it, there would have been nothing to investigate, and the quiet corruption of 30 years would have continued its quiet half-life undisturbed. Holmes came through from the back room in the late afternoon and lowered himself into his chair, reaching for his pipe in the habitual unhurried way that meant the case had been placed in its completed compartment, and the mind was releasing it. "It is not always the hand that strikes which shapes the crime," I said, half to myself, "but the mind that conceals it." Holmes lit his pipe and regarded me through the first drift of smoke with an expression that was, by his standards, almost warm. "That is very nearly an aphorism, Watson," he said. "I have my moments." "You do?" He settled back. "Though I would amend it slightly. It is not the mind that conceals the crime which ultimately shapes it. It is the mind that chooses, at the moment of concealment, to believe that concealment and resolution are the same thing." He drew on his pipe thoughtfully. "They never are. Pembroke believed that destroying Lady Fairleigh's documents destroyed the problem they represented. Instead, he merely converted a private wrong into a public one and made himself its author." Outside, the afternoon was declining toward evening, and the lamps were beginning to be lit along Baker Street one by one, each small flame establishing its particular circle of light in the thickening dusk. I watched them, and thought of the fragment of paper behind the great flange, the smear of disturbed wax on the blotter, the 2 inks in a dead woman's testament. How much had turned upon how little, and how the smallest traces of human intention, if examined with sufficient patience and precision, would eventually yield their testimony. "The case came to you through the very man responsible for its central crime," I observed, after a while. "And it did," said Holmes, "which I consider a point very much in Lady Fairleigh's favour. She did not tell Pembroke the full extent of what she knew. She withheld the essential thing from him, and in doing so she ensured that even through the instrument of the man she did not fully trust, the thread of the matter was placed where it could be followed." He paused. "She was, in a sense, her own final testament. She could not sign the document. But she arranged, with considerable foresight, that the truth of it should not go entirely unsigned. We sat together in the comfortable silence of Baker Street as the evening settled around us, the fire building its low warmth against the November cold, the fog beginning once more to gather at the window in its habitual unhurried way, are patient and impersonal and indifferent to the small human dramas taking place behind the glass. Holmes smoked. I read, and this time I turned the pages. And gradually, in the manner of all things that have run their course, the affair of Lady Fairleigh's testament receded into the particular quietude of resolved cases, becoming one more entry in the long and various record of a friendship, a partnership, and an unusual life conducted at the intersection of reason and the inexhaustible complexity of human nature. Of that life, this has been one account. There are others, but for this one at least the fog has lifted, and what lay beneath it has been, if not entirely restored, then at least brought to light.